February 19th, 1944. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Rabaul in a command bunker that had been carved from stone by thousands of laborers over 2 years, Admiral Ichiro Nakamura sat alone at his desk. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of earth and sweat and something else, something harder to name. Fear, perhaps, or the slow realization of obsolescence. His hand trembled slightly as he dipped his pen in ink. Above him, through layers of rock and concrete, he could hear the distant rumble of American B-24 Liberators making their daily run over the fortress. The sound had become as regular as sunrise, as predictable as death itself. He began to write knowing that if these words were discovered, they would earn him a court-martial, possibly execution. But the truth demanded to be recorded even if no one would ever read it. The Americans are not fighting us, they are strangling us. Each bypassed garrison is another weight dragging the empire toward the ocean floor. Nakamura paused, listening to the bombers pass overhead. Not a single Japanese fighter rose to intercept them. There were no fighters left, no fuel to fly them even if there were. The cream of the Imperial Navy's Aviation 173 of Japan's finest carrier pilots had been sent here 6 months ago to defend Rabaul against an American invasion that never came. Now they were dead, shot down in November by American carriers that appeared from nowhere, devastated the air groups, and vanished back into the vast Pacific. The carriers never even attempted to land troops. They simply erased Japan's naval aviation and sailed away, leaving Rabaul untouched, unconquered, and completely meaningless. 100,000 Japanese troops sat on this volcanic island, the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific, watching American forces sail past toward Japan like ships in the night. They might as well have been invisible. Nakamura set down his pen and closed his eyes. In his mind, he could see the fortress as it had been just 1 year ago. The pride of the empire. 5 airfields bristling with aircraft. Simpson Harbor filled with cruisers and destroyers. 367 anti-aircraft guns pointing at the sky like iron fingers. Miles of tunnels connecting ammunition dumps, hospitals, command centers, all carved from the living rock of the island. General Takeshi Saito had stood on the observation platform in November 1943, watching troops drill on the parade ground below, and proclaimed with absolute conviction that Rabaul was impregnable. The Americans will shatter themselves against our defenses like waves against a seawall, he had said. Every officer present had believed him. Why wouldn't they? The mathematics seemed unassailable. Any invasion force would be destroyed long before it reached the beaches. But the Americans had discovered something the Japanese had never considered. Something that rendered all those guns, all those troops, all that concrete and steel completely worthless. They had discovered that the quickest way to defeat a fortress is to ignore it. 6 months earlier, on a sweltering morning in June 1943, Captain Kenji Tanaka had been the first to see it. He was 34 years old, an intelligence officer with a reputation for seeing patterns others missed. While his fellow officers celebrated news that American forces had landed on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands, Tanaka stood in front of a large map of the Pacific marking the new American positions with red pins. The celebration around him was boisterous. Officers clapped each other on the back, laughing at American cowardice. "They're taking empty islands," one colonel had shouted. "They don't have the stomach to fight real Japanese positions." "Like mice," another officer agreed, afraid of the lion. But Tanaka wasn't laughing. He was looking at where those islands were located. Both Woodlark and Kirawina were small, barely defended atolls with virtually no strategic value. Except for one thing. Both had flat terrain suitable for airfield construction. He pulled out a compass and drew circles on the map, calculating the combat radius of American fighters and bombers operating from those islands. The circles overlapped, creating zones of air superiority that had nothing to do with attacking Rabaul. They were positioned to support the next leap forward, wherever that might be. Tanaka wrote a report that night. "The enemy does not behave like mice afraid of lions," he wrote. "They behave like engineers building a highway. Each island is not a conquest, but a construction site." But when he presented his analysis to General Saito the next morning, the general had dismissed it with an irritated wave of his hand. "Tokyo has confirmed that Rabaul is the linchpin of our entire defensive strategy," Saito said. "The Americans must attack us to advance. There is no other way." But there was another way. The Americans were inventing it as they went, and by the time the Japanese understood what was happening, it was far too late. The pattern became clearer with New Georgia. On June 30th, 1943, American forces landed on the island and immediately drove toward the airfield at Munda Point. This time there was real fighting. 10,500 Japanese defenders battled fiercely for every meter of jungle, turning the advance into a 2-month bloodbath. Finally, in August, the Americans secured Munda Airfield. Officers at Rabaul had followed the battle closely, noting American casualties, calculating the cost of the American advance. See, one colonel had said they cannot sustain these losses. They will reconsider their strategy. But then the Americans did something incomprehensible. They stopped. No pursuit of retreating Japanese forces, no attempt to clear the rest of the island. They took the airfield, brought in construction battalions, and within weeks had extended the runway and built fuel depots. Then they moved on to the next objective, leaving thousands of Japanese soldiers alive on New Georgia, all isolated and forgotten. Major Kenji Hatano, who survived the battle and made his way back to Rabaul by submarine, filed a report that sent chills through anyone who read it carefully. "The Americans fight differently," he wrote. "They take what they need and leave us the rest. It is as if our existence is incidental to their plans." Nakamura had read that report in September, sitting in his quarters late at night, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He pulled out his maps and began studying the American advance with new eyes. Woodlark, Kiriwina, New Georgia, each one positioned to provide air cover for the next leap forward. They weren't capturing Japanese bases. They were creating a highway of airfields across the Pacific, each one extending their reach, each one making the next jump possible. They were building something unprecedented, a mobile, flexible offensive that could flow around obstacles like water finding the path of least resistance. And Rabaul, the mighty fortress, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was rapidly becoming nothing more than an obstacle to be floated around. He had gone to General Saito with his concerns. It was late October 1943, and the two men sat in Saito's office drinking tea and speaking quietly. The general was 58 years old, a career officer who had risen through the ranks by following doctrine, respecting hierarchy, and never questioning orders from Tokyo. Admiral Saito had said, "You worry too much. Our intelligence confirms that the Americans are taking heavy casualties. Their public is growing weary of the war. They will negotiate before they reach Japan." Nakamura had chosen his words carefully. "General, what if the Americans bypass us entirely? What if they decide Rabaul is not worth their casualties?" The silence that followed was profound. Saito had set down his teacup with great precision, his face hardening. "That is impossible," he said finally. "Tokyo has made it clear that Rabaul is essential to their strategy. The Americans cannot advance without neutralizing this base. But what if they redefine what neutralization means?" Nakamura had pressed gently. "What if making us irrelevant is the same as destroying us?" Saito had stood, then the meeting clearly over. "Admiral, you are tired. Perhaps you should rest." These doubts served no purpose. Nakamura had left without another word, but he saw something in Saito's eyes before he turned away. A flicker of uncertainty, a hairline crack in the armor of absolute confidence. The general had heard him even if he could not acknowledge it. That crack would become a chasm 5 days later. November 1st, 1943. Tokyo made a decision that would haunt the empire for the rest of the war. With American forces threatening Bougainville, Imperial headquarters decided to reinforce Rabaul with the most precious resource Japan possessed. Carrier aircraft, 173 planes from 6 carriers, Zuikaku, Shikaku, Zuho, Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho, 82 Zero fighters, 45 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 6 reconnaissance planes. But more important than the aircraft were the men flying them. These were not fresh recruits. These were the veterans. The survivors of Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, the Coral Sea Midway. Men with hundreds of hours of combat experience, irreplaceable skills, and the institutional knowledge of naval aviation accumulated over years of war. Japan's last truly experienced carrier pilots, all concentrated at one base, betting everything on a single fortress. When the news arrived, Saito had been ecstatic. Finally, he proclaimed to his staff, "We will crush the American fleet when they come for Rabaul. This is the decisive battle we have been preparing for." Nakamura had said nothing, but he remembered thinking that concentrating all of Japan's carrier aviation at Rabaul was like putting all of the empire's eggs in one very obvious basket. And the Americans had shown repeatedly that they preferred not to attack obvious targets directly. On November 5, 1943, dawn radar, operators detected a large incoming formation, 97 aircraft from the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. The sky over Rabaul erupted into chaos. Japanese pilots scrambled with desperate speed. Zeros climbed to meet the attackers. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the air with black puffs of explosive shells. The battle lasted for hours. Japanese pilots fought with extraordinary courage and skill, just as they had been trained. But they were outnumbered and caught by surprise. By the end of the day, 4 heavy cruisers had been heavily damaged. 2 light cruisers were crippled. Dozens of aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or shot down in combat. And then the Americans left. They didn't land troops. They didn't attempt to seize the harbor. They simply withdrew over the horizon, leaving Rabaul battered but unconquered. 6 days later, they came back, this time with 3 more carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence. The second raid was even more devastating than the first. By the time it ended, 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft had been destroyed. 82 of 193 aircrew were dead. Every remaining warship in Simpson Harbor had been damaged. And still the Americans did not invade. Commander Yasuo Kurihara was one of the Zero pilots who survived. Nakamura would never forget the sight of him stumbling into the command bunker after the second raid. His face was burned, the skin red and blistered. His flight suit was scorched and torn. He could barely stand. General Saito had rushed forward, desperate for good news, desperate for confirmation that all the sacrifice had meant something. Commander Saito had set his voice tight with emotion. "Your report. We fought bravely. Yes, we drove them back." Kurihara had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. His lips trembled. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "We won, General," he said quietly. "We drove them off." There was a moment of relief in the room. Officers began to smile. But then Kurihara's face crumpled, and the next words came out broken, confused, almost childlike in their incomprehension. "So why does it feel like we lost?" The room fell silent. "They destroyed our planes?" Kurihara went on, his voice rising now, edged with something close to hysteria. "Sank our ships, shot down our best pilots, men I trained with, men I flew with for years, and then they just sailed away. We can't chase them, can't strike back. We can only wait. Wait for them to return, if they choose to return." He swayed on his feet. 2 officers moved to steady him, but he shook them off. His eyes found Saito's, and in them was a terrible question that no one wanted to answer. General Kurihara said, "Did we matter to them at all? Or were we just a chore? Something to be checked off a list before they moved on to what really mattered?" No one spoke, because everyone in that bunker in that moment understood. The Americans weren't trying to conquer Rabaul. They were trying to make it meaningless. And they were succeeding. Nakamura went back to his quarters that night and wrote in his journal for the first time. The entry was short, but it captured everything he was beginning to understand. "They are not fighting us," he wrote. "They are erasing us, making us obsolete. And I do not know which terrifies me more, the dying or the not mattering." Over the following weeks, the full scope of the disaster became clear. Japan had lost its last pool of experienced carrier pilots, the men who should have been training the next generation, defending the fleet, protecting the home islands. They had died defending a base that the Americans had already decided not to attack. Admiral Manechi Koga, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had gambled Japan's naval aviation on Rabaul and lost. The carriers sailed back to Japan with empty flight decks, their air groups decimated, their combat effectiveness gutted. It would take months to train new pilots, and those pilots would never have the skill or experience of the men who died over Rabaul in November 1943. By December, the reality of Rabaul's situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The supply situation began to deteriorate with terrifying speed. Lieutenant Toshikazu Omori was the supply officer, a meticulous man who kept detailed records of every ton of food, fuel, and ammunition that arrived at the base. In early December, he hung a large chart in the command center showing the monthly supply deliveries. General Saito had ordered him to take it down. "Why show everyone this?" the general had demanded. Omori's response was quiet but devastating. "Because everyone should know the mathematics of our death, sir." The chart told a story of slow strangulation. November 1943, 30,000 tons of supplies per month. Fuel reserves at 60%. Ammunition adequate for 6 months of combat. December 1943, 18,000 tons. American submarines were sinking 2 ships for every one that arrived. January 1944, 2,000 tons. No surface vessels had reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. February 1944, the month Nakamura was writing in his journal, 0 tons. Tokyo had stopped sending supply convoys entirely. Fuel reserves were down to 30% and falling. Food stocks were becoming critical. 100,000 soldiers with enough ammunition to fight for years were slowly starving because no one was coming to resupply them. The most fortified position in the Pacific was being defeated not by American guns, but by American submarines, American air superiority, and American patience. Nakamura thought about the strategy, constantly trying to understand it fully. The Americans had discovered that every island garrison, no matter how strong, had one fatal weakness: logistics. Without supplies, even the mightiest fortress becomes a prison. The soldiers don't die from enemy bullets. They die from disease, malnutrition, and the slow rot of purposelessness. And the cruelest part was that Tokyo kept sending orders as if nothing had changed. Maintain readiness for offensive operations. Prepare to intercept enemy supply lines. Coordinate with fleet movements. The messages arrived by submarine-delivered radio parts, and they were increasingly divorced from reality. How could they maintain readiness when they had no fuel for the ships? How could they intercept enemy supply lines when they couldn't even protect their own? How could they coordinate with fleet movements when the fleet had abandoned them? Captain Tanaka, the intelligence officer who had seen the pattern first, began compiling reports on other bypassed garrisons. The information came in slowly through submarine contacts and occasional radio messages, but the picture that emerged was haunting. Rabaul was not alone. Wake Island. Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakurai commanded 4,000 troops on that tiny atoll. It had once been a vital refueling point for trans-Pacific flights, a strategic gem. Now it was a dismissed outpost. Sakurai's messages to Tokyo grew increasingly desperate as the months passed. November 1943, enemy carrier aircraft struck installations. Awaiting invasion force. All positions manned and ready. January 1944. No invasion materialized. Enemy ships passed by, weakly beyond range of coastal guns. Request instructions. April 1944. Food situation, critical. Fishing provides some relief, but insufficient for garrison. Many men showing signs of malnutrition. When will relief come? No one answered his messages. Wake Island had become unnecessary to American plans, and the Americans saw no point in wasting lives capturing it. Truk Lagoon, supposedly impregnable with its massive fleet anchorage and 27,000 troops. Vice Admiral Masami Sato commanded the 4th Fleet there, confident that Truk would be the site of a decisive naval battle. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, Operation Hailstone shattered that confidence. American carriers appeared from nowhere and launched wave after wave of aircraft. 2 days of attacks destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons. 4,500 Japanese personnel died, and then the Americans left without landing a single soldier. Sato's report to Combined Fleet Headquarters was a masterpiece of controlled despair. The American carriers appeared from nowhere, he wrote, struck with overwhelming force and vanished. We could not pursue. We could not retaliate. We could only endure and repair damage, knowing they will return when they choose. This is not warfare. This is systematic humiliation. WWII Atoll, Major General Katsumi Yamamoto, 6,426 troops. March 1944. The enemy task force sailed past again today. Close enough to see through binoculars, but beyond reach of our guns. They do not even consider us worth destroying. May 1944 received radio message that all available forces being concentrated for decisive battle. We are not included. We have become military orphans, abandoned children of a losing war. August 1944. Men have begun cultivating gardens. This is not warriors' work, but survival demands it. I fear we are becoming farmers, not soldiers. Nakamura read these reports and felt a growing horror, not at the prospect of death, which every soldier accepts, but at the prospect of insignificance. 200,000 Japanese soldiers across the Pacific equipped with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, elaborate fortifications, all of it useless. Not casualties. Something worse. Military assets transformed into liabilities. We were consuming resources, tying down men who could be defending Japan itself. The Americans had turned time into a weapon. Every day that passed weakened the bypass garrisons, while American forces grew stronger, leaping from island to island, building infrastructure, creating an unstoppable momentum. Japanese strongholds rotted in tropical isolation, while the real war moved on without them. By February 1944, when Nakamura sat in his bunker writing his journal, the truth was inescapable. Rabaul would never see the glorious battle its defenders had prepared for. There would be no heroic last stand, no banzai charge into American guns, no honorable death in service of the emperor. Instead, there would be slow decay, hunger, disease, the grinding humiliation of being forgotten while still alive. He finished his journal entry and hid the book in a hollowed-out section of his desk. Above him, the B-24 Liberators continued their daily milk run, flying over Rabaul with impunity, not even bothering to drop bombs anymore. They were just reminding the garrison below that the war had moved on. 100,000 of Japan's finest warriors sitting on a volcanic island, waiting for a battle that would never come. That was the terror of the island-hopping strategy. Not that it killed Japanese soldiers, but that it made them invisible, erased them from the strategic calculations, turned fortresses into prisons and warriors into what Nakamura didn't have a word for it yet, but he would. Soon enough, they would all have a word for what they had become. March 1st, 1944. The command bunker at Rabaul was more crowded than it had been in months. General Takeshi Saito had summoned every senior officer, every colonel and major who commanded troops across the sprawling fortress complex. They filed in slowly, these veterans of Singapore and Manila and Java men who had conquered half of Asia and believed themselves invincible. The room fell silent when Saito entered. He looked older than his 58 years. The confidence that had defined him 6 months ago had eroded, replaced by something harder to name. Resignation, perhaps, or the quiet despair of a man who understands that history has passed him by. In his hand, he carried a single sheet of paper. A radio message from Tokyo decoded that morning. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Colonel Norio Takeda watched from the back of the room. He was 42 years old, a career infantry officer with 20 years of service. His regiment had fought in China, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. He had trained his entire adult life in the art of war, in tactics and strategy, and the samurai code of Bushido. He had never expected to be afraid of a piece of paper. Saito cleared his throat. His voice when he spoke was barely audible. "Gentlemen," he began, then stopped. He seemed unable to continue for a moment. Then he forced himself to read. "Due to the current supply situation, all units at Rabaul must become self-sufficient. Priority is to be given to food production. Combat operations are now of secondary importance." The room erupted, not with shouts, but with the susurrus of disbelief, officers murmuring to each other, certain they had misheard. Secondary combat operations? Impossible. Saito raised his hand for silence. His face was ashen. "There is more," he said. "Effective immediately, 50% of all duty hours will be devoted to agricultural activities. Each soldier is required to cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders will be evaluated based on agricultural yield." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed. A single sharp bark of laughter that cut through the silence like a knife. The laugh died quickly when the officer realized no one else was joining him, when he understood that this was not a joke, or a mistake, or a temporary measure. This was reality. Colonel Takeda felt something crack inside his chest. 20 years. 20 years of training, of discipline, of preparation for the glorious death that awaited every true warrior. And now this, orders to farm, to grow vegetables, to be evaluated not on combat readiness but on crop yields. He stood, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "General, you cannot be serious about this order." Saito would not meet his eyes. "It comes from Tokyo," he said quietly. "It is not a suggestion. It is a directive." Admiral Nakamura, who had been standing silently in the corner, spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more devastating. Gentlemen, he said, do you understand what Tokyo is telling us? What they cannot say directly. Every eye in the room turned to him. We are no longer an army, Nakamura continued. We are a liability. Tokyo cannot feed us, cannot supply us, cannot evacuate us. So they are telling us in the only way they can to stop being soldiers and start being survivors. They are asking us to save ourselves because they cannot save us. The silence that followed was absolute, because everyone in that room, even those who wanted to deny it, knew he was right. A young major in the front row stood up, his face flushed with emotion. This is dishonor, he said. We are samurai. We do not farm like peasants. We fight. We die with honor. That is our purpose. Nakamura looked at him with something like pity. And what honor is there in dying of starvation, Major? What glory in wasting away in a bunker, while the war you trained for happens elsewhere? Tokyo is not asking us to abandon honor. They are asking us to redefine what honor means when the battle we prepared for will never come. The major sat down slowly, his face crumbling. Saito spoke again, his voice stronger now, as if Nakamura's words had given him permission to accept the unacceptable. These are our orders, gentlemen. We will follow them. Dismissed. The officers filed out in silence. No one met anyone else's eyes. They were ashamed, though, whether of the orders or of their inability to refuse them, no one could say. The transformation began the next day. It happened slowly at first, almost tentatively, as if the officers hoped that by moving slowly enough, they might somehow avoid the humiliation of what they were being asked to do. But the orders were clear, and they had been drilled since basic training to follow orders without question. Vunakanau Airfield, once the busiest of Rabaul's 5 airstrips, became the first agricultural zone. The concrete runways remained monuments to a war that had already moved on, but the grassy areas between them were marked out in precise squares, 100 square meters per man. Soldiers who had maintained Zeros and Betty bombers now learned to turn soil to plant seeds to distinguish between types of fertilizer. The anti-aircraft gun positions that ring the harbor were converted into chicken coops. The massive guns still pointed skyward, but they had no ammunition and no targets. Between them, soldiers built crude wooden structures and filled them with chickens traded from local villagers. The sound of clucking replaced the boom of artillery. Ammunition bunkers carved deep into the volcanic rock and designed to withstand direct hits from battleship guns became storage for farming equipment and seed stocks. The irony was not lost on anyone. They had enough ammunition to fight for years, but no food to eat while doing it. Colonel Takeda found himself assigned to oversee agricultural production for his entire regiment. 3,000 men elite infantry who had conquered Rabaul in January 1942. Without losing a single soldier, were now his farming collective. He stood in what had once been a parade ground, now divided into neat rows of plots, and felt the weight of absurdity crushing down on him. A young private approached him, saluting crisply despite the hoe in his hand. Private Ichiro Sato, 19 years old, fresh-faced and earnest. Sir, he said, I need to request additional fertilizer for Section 7. The soil quality is poor and the sweet potato seedlings are not taking well. Takeda returned the salute automatically. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. What could he say? That he had no idea about fertilizer or soil quality or sweet potato cultivation, that he was an infantry colonel, not an agricultural officer, that this entire situation was a nightmare from which he desperately wanted to wake. Proved, he said finally. Coordinate with the supply section. Sato hesitated. There was something else, clearly something he wanted to say, but was afraid to voice. Takeda knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of young soldiers before their first combat, the need to speak, but the fear of appearing weak. Say it, Private Takeda ordered gently. Sir Sato said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground. My father was a farmer in Hokkaido. I joined the army because I did not want to be a farmer. I wanted to be a soldier, to serve the emperor, to bring honor to my family. And now, his voice cracked. He looked up and Takeda saw tears in the young man's eyes. Now I am farming again, Sato continued. Just like my father, except I am doing it in a uniform and calling it military service. My father wanted this life for me. I ran from it, and the war has brought me right back to it. He was not quite crying, but he was close. Takeda put his hand on the young man's shoulder. He wanted to say something reassuring, something about duty and honor and the importance of survival. But the words would not come, because he understood exactly what Sato was feeling. The sense that they had been robbed not just of their purpose, but of their very identity. "We do what we must," Private Takeda said finally. "That is all any soldier can do." It was inadequate, and they both knew it. "Dismissed," Takeda said. Sato saluted and walked away, shoulders slumped. That night, Takeda wrote in his journal. It was something he had started doing after seeing Nakamura writing in his A Way to Preserve Sanity by recording the insanity around him. "My samurai ancestors would weep to see us," he wrote. "We who trained to die gloriously in battle now tend sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not only defeated us, they have stripped us of our very identity, leaving us suspended between warrior and farmer, belonging to neither world." The weeks passed. April became May. May became June. The farming continued with grim determination because orders were orders and Japanese soldiers followed orders. Some men discovered they had a talent for agriculture. Others struggled but persisted because failure was not acceptable. A very few, quietly lost their minds and had to be confined to the medical facilities carved into the rock. Captain Tanaka, the intelligence officer, compiled reports on the transformation with his characteristic attention to detail. By June 1944, he calculated that 60% of all military activity at Rabaul was agricultural. Combat drills had been reduced to 2 hours per day. Weapons maintenance was performed once per week instead of daily. The mighty fortress had become a vast prison farm, and its inmates were both guards and prisoners of their own obsolescence. But the food they grew was not enough. It could never be enough. 100,000 men require enormous quantities of calories, and despite their best efforts, the harvest fell short. Rations were cut, then cut again. By mid-1944, each soldier was receiving 400 grams of rice per day, supplemented by whatever vegetables they could grow and whatever fish they could catch. Hunger became a constant companion. Not starvation, not yet, but the gnawing, persistent ache of never quite having enough. Men grew thin. Their uniforms hung loose. They moved more slowly, conserving energy, their bodies adapting to scarcity. Dr. Shigeo Yamamoto, the chief medical officer, tracked the deterioration with clinical precision. December 1943. Malaria cases increasing, but medical supplies adequate. Quinine reserves for 4 months. Combat readiness, 85%. March 1944. 30% of garrisons suffering from malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. Quinine exhausted using local bark substitutes with limited effectiveness. Combat readiness, 60%. June 1944, malnutrition now primary concern. Rice rations cut to 400 grams. Soldiers supplementing with jungle plants, many toxic. 17 deaths from poisonous vegetation this month. Combat readiness, 40%. The fortress that had been designed to defeat any invasion was defeating itself from within. And then, on July 15, 1944, the Americans reminded them that they had not been forgotten, just rendered meaningless. It was a clear morning, the kind of tropical perfection that would have been beautiful in peacetime. Colonel Takeda was inspecting the cornfields that had been planted along the old taxiway of Vunakanau airfield. The corn was growing well, tall green stalks that represented 6 months of backbreaking labor. If the harvest was good, it might mean the difference between hunger and something approaching adequacy. He heard the aircraft engines before he saw them. 12 B-24 Liberators flying in formation at medium altitude. For a moment, just a moment, Takeda felt his heart race. His hands trembled. His breath caught. Finally, he thought, finally they are attacking. Finally, we matter again. Soldiers ran for the bunkers, old instincts taking over. But Takeda stood in the middle of the cornfield, looking up, waiting. Part of him wanted the mush to fall on the command bunker, the gun emplacements, the harbor. He wanted to fight, even if fighting meant dying. He wanted to be a soldier again, not a farmer in uniform. Anything was better than this slow rot of purposelessness. The bombs began to fall. He watched them tumble from the bomb bays, dark shapes against the blue sky, waited for the whistle of their descent, prepared himself for the shock wave, the noise, the violence of high explosives. But the bombs did not fall on the military installations. They fell on the cornfields. The explosions marched across the agricultural zones in neat rows, systematically destroying 6 months of work in 6 minutes. The corn that had been growing so well, that had represented hope and survival and the possibility of endurance, disappeared in eruptions of dirt and fire. The irrigation ditches they had dug by hand collapsed. The tool sheds exploded into splinters. The carefully tended earth was cratered and scorched. And then the fighter planes came, P-38, lightning swooping low, their machine guns chattering. But they did not strafe the gun positions or the remaining buildings. They shot up the fishing boats pulled up on the beach. They destroyed the chicken coops, sending feathers and blood into the air. They riddled the vegetable gardens with bullets, shredding the plants, making the earth itself hostile. 10 minutes after it began, it was over. The aircraft formed up and flew away, leaving behind burning fields and the ruins of Rabaul's attempt to feed itself. Takeda stood in the middle of the devastation, ash falling around him like snow. He was not wounded. Not a single bomb had fallen near enough to hurt him, but something inside him had broken nonetheless. He began to laugh, not the laugh of joy or even of madness, but something else entirely. The laugh of a man who has finally understood the joke, even though the joke is on him. The laugh of someone who has been shown with perfect clarity exactly how powerless he truly is. "They know," he said aloud, though no one was near enough to hear. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "They know exactly how to hurt us. Not by killing the warrior. That would be mercy. They kill the hope instead. They let us survive just long enough to watch everything we build turn to ash." He looked down at his hands. They were covered in dirt from tending the corn. Farmers' hands, now not a warrior's. The Americans had not just destroyed his crops. They had shown him how completely his transformation was, how thoroughly he had been diminished. Private Sato found him there 20 minutes later, still standing in the ruined cornfield. The young man's face was streaked with tears and ash. "Sir," he said, his voice breaking. "What do we do now?" Takeda looked at him for a long moment. The boy was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. Why should he? What was there left to be ashamed of? They had already been stripped of everything else. "We start again," Takeda said, finally, his voice empty of emotion. "Because that is what soldiers do. We follow orders. We endure. We survive, even when survival feels like the cruelest order of all." But even as he said it, he wondered if they were still soldiers at all, or if they had become something else entirely, something without a name. The news of the bombing spread through the garrison like a disease. Other bypassed fortresses had experienced similar attacks. The Americans, it seemed, had decided that even the pretense of ignoring them was unnecessary. They could afford to expend a few bombs, a few bullets, just to remind the Japanese garrisons that they were trapped helpless and completely at the mercy of an enemy that did not even hate them enough to finish them quickly. Admiral Nakamura received reports from other islands through the submarine radio network that still functioned sporadically. The pattern was consistent. Truk Wake, WWII Marcus Island. All of them experienced periodic raids that targeted not military installations, but survival infrastructure, gardens, fishing boats, water collection systems, anything that might give the garrison hope of enduring. It was psychological warfare of a kind the Japanese had never anticipated. The Americans were not trying to kill them. They were trying to make their survival as difficult and humiliating as possible, while the real war moved on toward Japan. Nakamura sat in his quarters that night, adding a new entry to his journal. "Today I learned there are different kinds of defeat," he wrote. "There is the defeat of being conquered, which carries a certain honor. There is the defeat of being destroyed, which at least acknowledges the enemy considered you dangerous enough to eliminate. But then there is this, the defeat of being dismissed, of having the enemy expend just enough effort to remind you that they could destroy you at any time, but you are not worth the ammunition it would require. That is a defeat that hollows out the soul." In June 1944, while Rabaul's garrison struggled to replant their destroyed crops, the Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded hundreds of miles to the north. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Tanaka commanded Japan's carrier fleet in what was supposed to be the decisive naval engagement of the war. His carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft against the American fleet. The result was catastrophe. 645 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, 3,000 men dead. American losses were 123 aircraft and 109 men killed. a kill ratio of nearly 10 to 1. When Nakamura read the report delivered by submarine 3 weeks after the battle, he understood immediately what had happened. Tanaka's pilots were not like the veterans who had died at Rabaul in November. These were boys hastily trained with less than 100 hours of flight time. They flew into combat against American pilots who had hundreds of hours of experience, who had been training continuously while the Japanese training programs fell apart due to lack of fuel and lack of instructors. Because the instructors, the veterans who should have been teaching the next generation, were dead, shot down over Rabaul defending a base that did not need defending, or trapped on bypassed islands, their skills and experience wasting away while they grew vegetables. Tanaka's after-action report was brief and devastating. "We have carriers without pilots," he wrote. "Pilots without experience, and experience without any opportunity to be gained. The enemy's bypass strategy has not merely defeated us, it has crippled our ability to ever become capable of winning again. They have not just won battles. They have made it impossible for us to create the warriors who could fight future battles." The mathematics were inescapable. Japan had started the war with perhaps 5,000 truly skilled naval aviators. By mid-1944, fewer than 500 remained. The rest were dead or trapped on islands the war had left behind. And the training pipeline that should have been creating new veterans had collapsed because there was no fuel for training flights, no time for proper instruction, and no experienced pilots to do the instructing. The island-hopping strategy had not just bypassed Japanese strongpoints. It had decapitated Japan's ability to wage naval air warfare, all without fighting a single decisive battle for bases like Rabaul or Truk. At Rabaul, the summer of 1944 passed in a haze of hunger and futility. The corn was replanted. Some of it grew. Much of it failed due to poor soil or lack of proper fertilizer or simple exhaustion on the part of the farmers who had once been soldiers. The fishing continued, though the American fighters had destroyed most of the good boats. Men waded into the shallows with improvised nets, catching whatever they could. The medical situation deteriorated. Malaria was endemic. Dengue fever swept through entire units. Dysentery became so common it was barely remarked upon. Dr. Yamamoto's reports grew grimmer each month. August 1944, 80% of garrison showing signs of malnutrition, disease rates exceeding 70%, no medical supplies received in 6 months, forced to reuse bandages, needles. 18 deaths this month, none from enemy action. General Saito aged a decade in those months. The confident officer who had proclaimed Rabaul impregnable was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man who spent his days signing agricultural reports and his nights staring at maps that no longer meant anything. The war had moved on. The Americans were in the Philippines. Saipan had fallen in July, and with it, Japan's absolute defense perimeter. The home islands were within range of American bombers now, and Rabaul sat on its volcanic island, defended by 100,000 men who had nothing left to defend and no one left to fight. In early August, a submarine managed to surface briefly near the harbor. It was too dangerous to dock, but they threw a waterproof container into the water. It washed ashore 2 days later. Inside was a single letter from Tokyo dated 3 months earlier. Saito opened it in front of his senior staff. His hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in months. Perhaps he had finally accepted the absurdity of their situation. Perhaps he had simply run out of the capacity to feel shock. He read aloud, his voice flat, emotionless. "Prepare for coordinated offensive operations in conjunction with fleet movements in the Philippine Sea. Maintain combat readiness. Be prepared to interdict enemy supply lines on short notice." The silence in the room was profound. Officers looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or weep. Then Saito began to laugh. Not the bitter laugh of Takeda in the cornfield, but something deeper and more terrible. The laugh of a man who has looked into the abyss and found it absurd rather than terrifying. "Coordinated offensive," he said, still laughing, shaking his head. "We have not seen a supply ship in 8 months. We have no fuel for the ships that remain. Half our men can barely walk from malnutrition, and Tokyo wants us to be ready for offensive operations." He set the letter down very carefully, as if it were made of glass. Then he looked around the room at his officers, these men who had followed him into this hell and stayed there because duty demanded it. Captain Tanaka spoke quietly, his voice gentle. General, I do not think Tokyo knows the true situation, or if they know, they cannot admit it. To acknowledge that Rabaul has become meaningless would be to acknowledge that the entire defensive strategy has failed. So they send us orders, Nakamura added, as if we still matter, as if we are still part of the war. Because the alternative is admitting that 100,000 soldiers have been written off, abandoned, left to fade away, while pretending they still serve a purpose. Saito was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost serene, the voice of a man who has made peace with the unbearable. We will acknowledge receipt of the order, he said. We will report that we are maintaining readiness as instructed. And then we will go back to our gardens. Because that is all we can do. That is all we have left. We will farm and we will survive, and we will wait for whatever ending comes for us. No one argued. There was nothing to argue about. They were phantoms in a fortress that had become a tomb, going through the motions of military discipline while slowly fading from the world's memory. Outside, the sun set over Simpson Harbor. Once it had been filled with warships, their flags flying proudly, their guns ready to defend the empire. Now a few damaged cruisers sat at anchor, too damaged to sail and too heavy to be moved to dry dock. They were monuments to a war that had already ended for Rabaul, though the garrison did not yet know when or how their own end would come. They only knew it would not be glorious. There would be no banzai charge, no heroic last stand, no songs sung about their sacrifice. There would only be the slow decay of being forgotten, the grinding humiliation of surviving while the war they had trained their entire lives to fight raged on without them. The Americans had invented a new kind of defeat, not death, but obsolescence. And there was no warrior code, no tradition, no philosophy that had prepared them for it. 600 miles to the north of Rabaul, on a barren volcanic island that would soon become infamous, Lieutenant Colonel Masaru Kobayashi stepped off a transport boat and onto black sand beaches for the first time. It was June 1944, and Iwo Jima was still relatively quiet, still untouched by the war that had consumed the Pacific. But Kobayashi knew with the certainty of a man who had studied every American move for the past year that this quiet would not last. He was 53 years old, considered ancient for a combat commander. Younger officers whispered that he should have been given a desk job in Tokyo, that his best years were behind him. But Kobayashi had something those younger officers lacked. He had paid attention. While others had celebrated Japanese victories and dismissed Japanese defeats, Kobayashi had studied the pattern of American operations with obsessive detail. He had read every report from Rabaul, from Truk, from Wake and Wooley and Marcus Island. He had analyzed the island-hopping strategy not with the contempt of a samurai for an enemy who refused honorable combat, but with the cold calculation of a chess player studying an opponent's opening moves. And he had reached a conclusion that would have gotten him court-martialed if he had voiced it in the wrong company. Japan could not win this war. Not anymore. Perhaps they never could have. But certainly not now. Not after the Americans had discovered how to turn Japanese strength into Japanese weakness, how to make fortresses into prisons, how to defeat armies without fighting them. But Iwo Jima was different. Iwo Jima could not be bypassed. The island sat directly on the flight path between the newly captured Marianas and the Japanese home islands. American B-29 bombers flying to Tokyo would pass directly over Iwo Jima. The Americans needed this island, needed it desperately, and Kobayashi intended to make them pay for every meter of volcanic ash. Not to win. Winning was impossible. But to make victory so costly that perhaps, just perhaps, the American people would lose their stomach for the invasion of Japan itself. Every Marine killed on Iwo Jima was one who could not participate in the invasion of the home islands. Every casualty, every delay, every moment of suffering he could inflict might save Japanese lives later. He did not share these thoughts with his officers. Instead, he simply gave orders that seemed to many of them completely contrary to every principle of Japanese military doctrine. No defenses on the beaches, he said on his third day on the island. The officers stared at him in disbelief. Every Japanese defensive position since the beginning of the war had concentrated on stopping the enemy at the water's edge, on making the beaches into killing zones where American troops would be slaughtered before they could establish a foothold. But Kobayashi had studied Tarawa, where Japanese beach defenses had been obliterated by naval bombardment before the Marines even landed. He had studied Saipan, where the same pattern had repeated. The Americans had learned to pour overwhelming firepower onto beach defenses to reduce them to rubble with battleship guns and carrier aircraft before a single landing craft touched sand. So there will be no troops on the beaches, he continued calmly. No pillboxes, no bunkers, nothing for their ships to shoot at. Let them land unopposed. The officers looked at each other, wondering if their commander had lost his mind. One brave major spoke up. Sir, if we allow them to land without resistance, they will establish their beachhead in hours. They will bring ashore tanks, artillery supplies. We will have given them the island. Kobayashi smiled, a thin expression with no warmth in it. We are not giving them the island, Major. We are inviting them into a grave. Our grave, certainly, but theirs as well. Over the following months, he explained his vision. The entire island would become a fortress, but a fortress unlike any Japan had built before. Not centered on the beaches, but burrowed deep into the volcanic rock of the island's interior. 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting 5,000 cave positions. Every cave prepared as a fighting position, provisioned with ammunition and supplies designed to survive bombardment and to exact the maximum toll on attackers. And absolutely no banzai charges, Kobayashi ordered. This drew even more shocked responses than the abandonment of beach defenses. The banzai charge was sacred to Japanese military tradition, the final expenditure of a warrior's life in service to the emperor, a glorious death that honored ancestors and terrified enemies. Kobayashi's voice was hard when he addressed this. Banzai charges are suicide, he said flatly. They waste lives and achieve nothing except giving the Americans easy targets. Every man who dies in a banzai charge is one less man defending Japan. I forbid them. Any officer who orders a banzai charge will answer to me personally. He paused, looking at the faces around him, seeing the shock and disapproval. I know what you are thinking, he said, that this is dishonorable, that we are abandoning Bushido. But I ask you to consider something. The men at Rabaul had honor. They had courage. They had fortresses and ammunition and the will to fight to the last man. And where are they now, growing vegetables on an island the war forgot? What honor is there in dying uselessly? What glory in throwing away lives that could kill 10, 20, 50 Americans before being killed in turn? The major who had spoken before asked quietly, Sir, what are we fighting for if not honor? Kobayashi's answer was immediate and fierce. We are fighting for time, for every American we kill on this island, for every day we delay their advance. We are not defending Iwo Jima, gentlemen. We are defending Japan itself. With our deaths, yes, but deaths that matter, deaths that cost the enemy so dearly that he thinks twice before attempting to invade our homeland. That is honor. That is Bushido, not the empty gesture of a suicide charge, but the cold calculation of maximum damage inflicted before the inevitable end. He wrote a letter to his wife that night. He knew she would never receive it while he lived, so he wrote with the freedom of a man already dead. He sealed it and gave it to a subordinate with instructions to send it only after Kobayashi had fallen. My beloved, he wrote, when you receive this, I will be gone. I do not fight to win, for that is impossible. I fight so that every Marine killed here is one less enemy to threaten our children. We do not defend this island. We defend Japan with our deaths. But unlike the garrisons at Rabaul and Truk, who died slowly of irrelevance, we will die with purpose. We will die in a way that matters, that costs the enemy, that makes them remember us not as obstacles bypassed, but as a price paid. That is the only victory left to us now. That is the only way our deaths can have meaning. Back at Rabaul, the autumn of 1944 brought a strange kind of peace. The Americans no longer bothered to bomb them at all. The fortress had achieved true invisibility. Even the periodic reminders of their powerlessness had ceased. They were simply forgotten, left to their slow dissolution while the war moved on. The harvest that fall was better than expected. The sweet potatoes came in strong, supplemented by corn and various local vegetables. For a few weeks, the garrison ate almost adequately. Not well, but adequately. It was enough to keep them alive, which was both a blessing and a curse. Because living meant enduring. It meant watching as the world changed around them, and they remained frozen in place, soldiers without a war, warriors without purpose. Radio messages brought news of American advances. The Philippines were being liberated. American bombers were striking Tokyo itself. The war was approaching its climax, and Rabaul played no part in it whatsoever. Private Ichiro Sato, who had cried over becoming a farmer, had become an excellent one. His plots produced more vegetables than anyone else in his company. He had a natural talent for it, an instinct for soil and water, and timing that his father would have recognized and approved of. Colonel Takeda had recommended him for commendation, though commendations for agricultural achievement felt like mockery of everything the military was supposed to represent. One evening in November, Takeda found Sato sitting alone by his vegetable plot looking at the sunset over Simpson Harbor. The young man was 20 years old now, though he looked older. They all did. Hunger and disease and despair aged men faster than years ever could. "May I join you?" Private Takeda asked. Sato scrambled to his feet, saluting. "Of course, sir." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the light fade over the harbor where rusting ships sat at anchor, going nowhere, doing nothing. Finally, Takeda spoke. "You are an excellent farmer, Sato. Your father would be proud." Sato's laugh was bitter. "My father wanted me to farm. I wanted to be a soldier. Now I am both and neither. A farmer in uniform, a soldier who never fights. I have become exactly what I tried to escape, except now I do it on an island prison instead of in Hokkaido." Takeda had no answer to that. It was too close to his own thoughts, his own sense of identity lost somewhere between the warrior he had trained to be and the agricultural supervisor he had become. "Do you think we will ever fight again?" Sir Sato asked quietly. Takeda considered lying, offering false hope. But the young man deserved honesty, and perhaps honesty was all they had left. "No," he said, "I do not think we will. The war has moved on. We are a garrison defending nothing, waiting for an attack that will never come. We have been erased from the strategic calculations. We exist, but we do not matter." "Then what are we?" Sato asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "What is the point of us?" Takeda took a long time to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than bitter. "We are a lesson," he said. "A lesson the Americans are teaching the world. That the best way to defeat an enemy is not always to destroy him. Sometimes it is enough to make him meaningless, to let him sit in his fortress armed and ready and simply walk past. We are proof that the future of warfare belongs not to the warrior, but to the logistician. Not to courage, but to calculation." He stood brushing volcanic ash from his uniform. "Get some rest, Private. Tomorrow we plant the winter crops." After Sato left, Takeda remained watching the stars emerge over the Pacific. He thought about his ancestors samurai, who had died in glorious battles whose names echoed through history. Would anyone remember Rabaul? Would anyone care that 100,000 soldiers had been defeated not by American courage or firepower, but by American indifference? Probably not. And that, he realized, was the point. The Americans had learned to defeat armies by erasing them from the story entirely. They had discovered that irrelevance was a weapon more devastating than any bomb. December 1944 brought the coldest Christmas most of the garrison had ever experienced, though the temperature remained tropical. The cold was internal, a chill of the spirit that no amount of sunshine could warm. There were no supplies for gifts, no special rations for the holiday. Some officers organized singing Christian hymns learned from childhood or picked up from Western education. The songs echoed strangely through the bunkers, carols of peace and goodwill, sung by men who were neither at peace nor receiving any goodwill from the world that had forgotten them. Admiral Nakamura spent Christmas evening with General Saito in the general's quarters. They drank weak tea, the last of the supply that had arrived 9 months earlier, stretched out to last as long as possible through endless rebrewing of the same leaves. "Do you think the war will end soon?" Saito asked. He looked old in the candlelight, his hair gone almost completely gray, his face deeply lined. He looked like a man of 70, not 58. Nakamura considered the question. "Based on the radio reports, yes. Japan is losing on every front. The Philippines will fall, then Okinawa, then the home islands themselves." Saito nodded slowly. "And we will still be here," he said, "tending our gardens, raising our chickens, forgotten." "Unless we are not forgotten," Nakamura said quietly. "Unless they decide to come and accept our surrender." Saito smiled, a sad expression that held no joy. "That would almost be a kindness, would it not? To acknowledge that we exist, to give us the dignity of formal surrender, rather than simply pretending we cease to matter. At least then we would know that someone somewhere remembers we are here." They sat in silence after that, two old men contemplating their erasure, waiting for a war to end that they had stopped fighting months ago. The new year came and went, January 1945, then February. The radio brought news of the American invasion of Iwo Jima on February 19th. Kobayashi's carefully prepared defenses met the Marines on the beaches with silence then erupted from underground as the Americans pushed inland. The battle was savage beyond anything the Pacific War had yet seen. The reports that filtered to Rabaul were fragmentary but telling. American casualties were enormous, far higher than any previous island battle. The Marines were paying for every meter of volcanic rock with blood. But they were advancing nonetheless, grinding forward with the inevitable momentum of a force that could afford casualties, that could replace losses that had the industrial might of America behind it. On March 26th, after 36 days of fighting, Iwo Jima was declared secure. American casualties were 26,000, including 6,800 dead. Japanese casualties were approximately 21,000, with only 216 captured alive. Lieutenant Colonel Kobayashi was not among the survivors. He had died in the final days of the battle, leading a night infiltration attack against American positions. Not a banzai charge, which he had forbidden, but a calculated raid designed to inflict maximum casualties. He had killed his last Americans with grenades and his sword before being cut down by machine gun fire. His letter to his wife was found on his body and eventually delivered. Years later, when General Holland Smith wrote his memoirs of the Pacific War, he called Kobayashi the most redoubtable of all our adversaries. The man had learned from the bypass strategy, had understood that the only value of a defensive position was the price it could exact from an attacker. And he had made the Americans pay that price to the last full measure. At Rabaul, the news of Iwo Jima's fall was received with complicated feelings: pride in the fierce defense, admiration for Kobayashi's tactics, but also shame that they had not been given the opportunity to die as meaningfully. The garrison had been bypassed so completely that even their deaths had been denied them. They could not even earn the warrior's end that Kobayashi and his men had achieved. April brought more news. American forces invaded Okinawa on April 1st. The battle would rage for months, involving over 500,000 men on both sides. Japan threw everything it had left at the invaders, including mass kamikaze attacks. But the outcome was never in doubt. Through all of this, Rabaul sat unchanged. The garrison now numbered approximately 69,000. Disease, malnutrition, and the occasional accident had claimed the rest over 2 years of isolation. They farmed their plots. They maintained the pretense of military discipline. They waited. On August 6, radio reports brought news of a new type of bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The details were unclear, but the devastation described was almost incomprehensible. A single bomb that had destroyed an entire city, killed 100,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, another such bomb fell on Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio. Most of the garrison had never heard the emperor speak before. His voice was high formal, using court Japanese that was difficult to understand. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The reaction in Rabaul was not what one might expect. There was no despair, no rage, no tears. Instead, there was a kind of numb confusion. The war was over, but what did that mean for them? They had not been fighting. They had been farming. In a sense, their war had ended 2 years ago, when the last American bombs fell and the world decided they did not matter enough even to destroy. General Saito called an assembly of all officers. He looked even older now, ancient beyond his years. His voice when he spoke was quiet but steady. "Gentlemen," he said simply, "His Majesty has spoken. The war is over. We must prepare for surrender." But there was a problem so absurd it might have been funny if it were not so tragic. There were no American forces on Rabaul, no one to surrender to. The Americans had bypassed them so thoroughly, had dismissed them so completely, that there was no one even present to accept their surrender. Colonel Takeda voiced the question everyone was thinking. "General, to whom do we surrender? There is no enemy here. We have been so successfully ignored that they have forgotten we exist." The statement hung in the air, the ultimate humiliation. They could not even surrender properly. They would have to wait, as they had waited for everything else, for the Americans to remember them and send someone to accept the surrender of a garrison that had ceased to be relevant 2 years earlier. The wait lasted 3 weeks. 3 surreal weeks of soldiers who were no longer at war but not yet at peace. They continued farming because there was nothing else to do. They maintained their weapons out of habit. They existed in a strange limbo, neither prisoners nor free men, neither defeated nor victorious. Finally, on September 6, 1945, HMS Glory arrived at Rabaul. British and Australian forces would accept the Japanese surrender since the Americans could not be bothered to divert resources to a garrison they had successfully ignored for 2 years. General Saito and Admiral Nakamura, wearing their best uniforms, carefully pressed, despite 2 years of privation when aboard the British carrier. The surrender ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory. A British general accepted their swords, had them sign documents. The British general was not unkind, but there was an awkwardness to the proceedings. He was a professional soldier, and he understood what these Japanese officers had endured. Not the glory of battle, but something worse. The slow erosion of purpose. General Saito, the British officer, said, "You surrender all forces and weapons under your command." "Yes," Saito replied, his voice steady now, all emotion long since burned out of him. 69,000 men, 5 airfields, 367 anti-aircraft guns, ammunition sufficient for years of combat, all of it unused, all of it meaningless. The British general nodded. There was a long pause. He seemed to want to say something to acknowledge the strangeness of accepting the surrender of a force that his side had defeated simply by ignoring it. Finally he spoke, and his voice was gentle, almost kind. "General," he said, "you understand, we did not need any of those things. We have not needed them for a very long time. Your fortress was formidable, your men were brave, but the war moved on without you. That was the point. That was the strategy." Saito's voice was barely a whisper. "I know," he said. There was nothing else to say. They had defended a fortress that did not need defending. They had prepared for a battle that never came. They had remained soldiers long after the war had moved on without them. They had been erased, and even their surrender was an afterthought. The ceremony ended. Saito and Nakamura returned to shore. The war was over, but what came next, they did not know. They only knew that they had survived something that felt worse than death. They had survived being forgotten. But the story of the bypassed garrisons did not end with surrender. In some cases, it did not end at all. On a small island in the Philippines called Lubang, a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada had received orders in December 1944. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi had been clear and emphatic. Never surrender. Continue guerrilla operations until the Imperial Army returns. Those are your orders. Yamada, 22 years old and fanatically loyal, had taken those orders to heart. When the war ended, when Japan surrendered, when Allied forces occupied the Philippines, Yamada and 3 other soldiers retreated into the jungle and continued fighting. They refused to believe the war was over. The surrender announcements were propaganda. The leaflets dropped from planes were tricks. The news broadcasts were lies. They fought on, through 1946, 1947, 1948. Years became decades. One by one of Yamada's companions died or surrendered. By 1974, he was alone, the last soldier of an army that had ceased to exist nearly 30 years earlier. He was finally located by a Japanese search party in March 1974. But even then, he refused to surrender. He was still following his orders. Never surrender. Wait for the army to return. Finally, his former commanding officer, now 70 years old, was flown to Lubang. Major Taniguchi, aged and tired and filled with sorrow for what his orders had wrought, found Yamada in the jungle on March 9th. Yamada stood before him, still in uniform, though it was tattered and patched, still carrying his rifle, still functional after 29 years, still ready to fight. Taniguchi's eyes filled with tears as he looked at this man who had followed his orders so faithfully for so long. "Lieutenant Yamada," he said, his voice breaking, "your mission is complete. You have served with honor beyond measure. I hereby relieve you of your duties. The war is over. You can come home now." Only then, on March 10, 1974, after 29 years of fighting a war that had ended before he was 30 years old, did Hiroshi Yamada surrender. When reporters asked him why he had continued for so long, his answer was simple and devastating. His eyes, when he spoke, looked far older than his 51 years. "I was waiting for the war to come back to me," he said quietly. "I never imagined it would leave me behind forever. I never imagined that being forgotten was possible, that the war could end and I would not even know, that I could matter so little that no one would remember to tell me it was over." He was not the only one. On Anadahan Island, 32 Japanese sailors had refused to believe the war ended and fought against no one until 1951. On Guam, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi hid until 1972, living on rats and mangoes, convinced that surrender meant death. These men were not heroes or madmen. They were the logical endpoint of the island hopping strategy's psychological impact. The war had abandoned them so completely that they could not conceive of its ending. They had been made so irrelevant that even peace could not find them. 20 years after the war ended in 1965, former General Takeshi Saito published his memoirs. After being convicted of war crimes for the treatment of Allied prisoners under his command, he had served time in Sugamo prison. Upon release, he built a replica of his prison cell in his garden and lived there until his death in 1968, donating all proceeds from his book to the families of Allied prisoners who had died at Rabaul. His assessment of the island hopping strategy was brutal in its honesty. "We studied Napoleon Clausewitz's Sun Tzu," he wrote. "We prepared for every form of warfare we could imagine. But the Americans invented something we never conceived of. Warfare by evasion. Victory through calculated dismissal. They transformed our greatest strength into our greatest weakness. Our willingness to die for our positions became meaningless when no one attacked those positions. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. We had ammunition for years of fighting, fortifications that could withstand any assault, the will to fight to the last man. None of it mattered. The Americans sailed past us toward Japan, and we could only watch. We were an army of phantoms, defending positions that had lost all value, holding territory that had no meaning, waiting for battles that would never come. This was their genius. They made us defeat ourselves. Every day we held our positions, we weakened Japan. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one less soldier defending the homeland. We were not defeated by American arms. We were defeated by American indifference. And there is no warrior tradition that prepares you for that." Admiral Nakamura lived longer until 1968. In his final journal entry, written days before his death, he reflected on what the island hopping strategy had taught him about the nature of warfare itself. "I have spent 23 years thinking about what happened to us." He wrote, his handwriting shaky now with age. "And I have reached a conclusion that I believe future military leaders must understand. There is something worse than dying in battle. There is living without meaning. We were prepared for death. We were prepared for suffering. We were not prepared for irrelevance. The Americans did not defeat our fortifications with superior force. They defeated them by making force irrelevant. They did not destroy our strategy. They made strategy itself obsolete. They showed the world that in modern warfare, the enemy you defeat most thoroughly is not the one you destroy, but the one you make meaningless. We were warriors of an ancient tradition, fighting an enemy from the future. And the future showed us that the best way to win a war is not to fight it everywhere. The best way to defeat an enemy is not to kill him, but to make him no longer matter. To let him sit in his fortress armed and dangerous and simply walk past on your way to victory. That is the lesson of Rabaul, of Truk, of Wake and WWII, and all the forgotten garrisons scattered across the Pacific. 300,000 soldiers neutralized without a major battle, not defeated by American bullets, but by American calculation, by American logistics, by American patience. We were not conquered. We were bypassed. We were not killed. We were forgotten. And that in the end was far more terrible than any death in combat could ever be. Because a warrior can accept death. But how does a warrior accept that his death does not matter, that his courage counts for nothing, that his sacrifice will not be remembered because it never had the chance to be made? These are the questions that haunted me for 23 years. These are the questions that will haunt military strategists for generations to come, because the Americans showed the world a new way to wage war, a way that renders obsolete everything we thought we knew about courage, honor, and military virtue. The future of warfare belongs not to the bravest warriors, but to the smartest logisticians, Not to those willing to die, but to those able to make the enemy's willingness to die irrelevant. Nakamura closed his journal for the last time and set down his pen. 3 days later, he was dead. The ruins of Rabaul still exist today, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle that surrounds them. The tunnels remain carved into volcanic rock, empty now, except for bats and memories. The gun emplacements still point at the sky, their barrels rusted, their mechanisms seized. The runways are cracked and overgrown monuments to aircraft that never flew. Tourists occasionally visit, walking through the tunnels where 100,000 men waited for a battle that never came, looking at the rusting guns that never fired in the defense. They were built for standing on beaches where no invasion ever landed. The fortress stands as a monument not to Japanese military might, but to its irrelevance. A reminder that in war, as in life, there are fates worse than defeat. And sometimes the cruelest victory is the one that does not even acknowledge the enemy's existence. The phantoms of the Pacific learned that lesson well. 300,000 soldiers scattered across dozens of islands, all experiencing the same slow dissolution. All learning that being made invisible is worse than being destroyed. Their story stands as a warning about the nature of modern warfare, about the power of logistics over courage, of strategy, over strength, of calculated indifference over passionate engagement. It is a story about how the rules of war changed and how those who clung to the old rules found themselves fighting battles that no longer mattered in a war that had moved on without them. In the end, they were not defeated by American superiority in any traditional sense. They were defeated by American innovation, by a new way of thinking about war that rendered obsolete everything they had trained for, everything they believed in, everything they had prepared to sacrifice themselves for. They were made invisible, and in their invisibility they discovered the ultimate truth about modern warfare. Sometimes the most devastating defeat is not being destroyed. It is being dismissed. It is not mattering at all.